So we were talking about mapping out the space of how you build web stuff and how you starting to talk about how you make decisions. So I was talking about micro and macro frameworks. Micro frameworks, like I said, they make it very quickly to in one line of, like in 2 lines of code, say when someone hits this URL, like start a server for me, when someone hits this URL, run this code, right? That's super handy because that used to take a lot of code and a lot of time. That's gotten very easy to do very quickly. That's cool. They also can do more than that. They can do login, they can do all this stuff. Macro frameworks are really built to give you the infrastructure you need, the architecture you need to write a classic web app. So what's a classic web app mean? Well, you have a database, you have backups of that database, you have a development version, you have a production version that's running live, you have lots of different tables in that database that do stuff. You have a bunch of different web pages that you can hit. You need a nice templating language so that you can render web pages really well. You probably need to send emails to people that are in the database. You probably have user accounts in the database. You probably need to run jobs once a night, like backup. You probably need to run once a night. You need to remotely administer your server, things like that. Like that's all the stuff that's part of writing a real web app. Macro frameworks have all of that stuff to a certain extent baked in, right? They either are built to let you do that stuff easily, or they have it so that you can do that stuff easily, okay? So how do you make a decision between one or the other? This is super hard, right? You need to make guesses about, in the medium to long term of what you're building, what will you need? And this is what I like to talk about as like deciding, like not coding you never want to solve problems that you wish you had, right? This is something that programmers do a lot. You're always like, oh, as soon as we get 10,000 users, we're going to need to optimize this. So let's do it. That is not a problem you have right now. So you should not do that right now. That is a waste of time. You should make a smart architecture decision so that when you need to do it, you can do it, and it's not hard, right? This is this question of deciding on architectures for your longer term, but only building within those architectures for your short term. So if you know that success, which you hope to have, looks like user accounts and sending emails and having like lots of maintenance things you need to be doing, then maybe that pushes you a little towards a macro framework. But if all you really need is user accounts, then maybe you should stay over with like a micro framework and grab a plugin that does user accounts for you, and grab a plugin that lets you talk to a database, right? Those are baked into the macro framework. But most micro frameworks, you can just sort of add the right set of plugins, and then you're basically at a macro framework. So a micro framework lets you be a little more flexible about how you move on this axis between things, right? You can have your one line of code, but then you can add in a plugin that lets you do user authentication, right? Now it's not architected for user authentication, so some things might be difficult, like maybe permissions isn't as easy as it would be over here, right? Or maybe like adding user comments isn't as easy as like downloading a plugin that does comments over here, right? In macro framework land. So it's hard to make these decisions. At this point in time, I mean, my experience, just to tell you where I'm biased, which you probably already tell, like I build most of my smaller websites with Flask and Python, and I build most of my bigger websites in Rails in Ruby. Now, that's a little inconsistent because like I'm not using Python the whole way down. That's because I'm a programmer, so I like learning lots of languages, and I like programming in different languages. I highly suggest like picking a language and sticking with it because life gets easier. Right now, JavaScript is really hot. So JavaScript could be that language for you. If you're interested in that, then look at Meteor, which is built on top of Node.js. That's like JavaScript everywhere, one language to rule them all, right? If you are sort of really interested in Python, then Flask is a great micro framework architecture, and Django is the equivalent of Rails in Python, right? So it's built, came out of newsrooms. It's built for building real websites, right? If you are really into Ruby, which shares a lot of similarities with Python in terms of its philosophy, then Sinatra is a really good micro framework, very similar to Flask, and Rails is a really good macro framework. So there's tons.
Yes. Okay.
And now here's the piece that we're sort of going to talk about in our last class, in the final class, which is about going from prototype to production. There are lots and lots and lots and lots of websites that help you write websites and host them, right? Like if you want to take your Flask app and make sure that it can handle 10,000 hits a minute, right? Then you can just pay someone to make that easy, right? And they take care of everything for you and give you a dashboard that shows you load charts, right? And tells you what your SOAS part of your code is, right? If you have money, any of these solutions can scale. So if you have to scale it yourself and you can't pay someone else to do it, then you need to make decisions a little bit differently. You need to figure out what hardware you have to work on, what is optimized for that hardware to work well, whether you can put it on Amazon, but really you're much better off paying someone else to scale things for you, unless you're a super nerd. Which there are many in this building. But there's a couple things worth mentioning here when we talk about to prefix before we jump into the tools. There are lots of websites that make writing this stuff together with other people easy too. So the best Google Docs for code that I've seen is Cloud9, c9.io. What do I mean by Google Docs for code? I mean it's an IDE in a browser, and you can basically clone your GitHub repo to their server, right? So you basically clone your GitHub repo, you sign in with your GitHub, you clone your repo to their server, and then it gives you this shared editing where you can both work on the same file together, right? Just like in Google Docs, where you can both edit the same document together. That's super handy for collaborating. Super handy. You press a button and then it runs it, right? It runs your web server. So if you're interested in trying that stuff out, then I suggest using c9.io. It's great for collaborating with people that aren't in the same place. It has limitations, of course, like memory and talking to other things, but for small things, it can work really well. And it gets you online very quickly, right? You don't have to deploy to a web server. It gives you this super ugly URL that you can send to someone to try out your app. So I'll come back to that afterwards. But what I want to show you is, I'll show you IDEs next time a little bit more. But let's dive into microframers, because this is where I find a lot of researchy projects. Ooh, thanks. A lot of researchy projects in this building that want to be websites could benefit from looking at microframeworks. I want to talk about this in positives and negatives. So positive, pretty easier learning curve. Not easy, but there's not that many simplifying assumptions that they make or conventions. There's just not that many, so you don't have to take long to learn to think Flask. And you get results really quickly. So the negatives, you can only do a few things out of the box. That said, those few things are turn a URL into serving back something that people can see, which is kind of the thing you want to do when you're building a web page. And it doesn't scale well when you add features. And I don't mean scale in terms of load handling. I mean scaling cognitively. Like, it's not architected to be something where there's a standard way to save users and a standard way to talk to a database, right? Of course, there's standard plugins you can pull in to do that, right? You pull in SQL Alchemy and it can do database stuff for you, but it's not built to sort of do that. So your cognitive load is a little higher as soon as you start to do that. So you need to make careful trade-offs.